This week, we're closing out 2021. We're going to talk about James Webb Space Telescope after launch as it makes its way to L2. We'll talk about what Lagrange points are. We'll talk about our actions and lessons from 2021 and what we look forward to in 2022. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Today in Space. I am your Space Science Podcast host from the East Coast, Alex Giafanos. It's December 31st, the last day of 2021, and we made it. We have survived the second year of this craziness, and I hope you guys are doing okay. I hope you're hanging in there. It's been an extremely long year. I think there's a lot of good that we can take from it, but obviously finding the good has been very difficult in this last year. And one of the amazing things about this time that we live in, in relation to this podcast and to the space industry, we are once again graced with progress of space and human space travel in a time of difficulty. If we think back to the Cold War, which helped start the original space race to the moon between the U.S. and the Soviets, that time was extremely turbulent, and it seemed that the space program was this beacon of hope of what the future could be, of what we could do. Think about how much sci-fi came out of that time when the world was in a really, really bad place, and there's a lot of confusion going on, and this year has been pretty crazy. Better than 2020, but of course we are looking for 2022 to be even more of an improvement because, well, we could only hope so. So I hope you're hanging in there. I know there's a lot going on, but I think there's a lot that we can pull from space and what's going on that can help us give some hope for the future. So what we're going to do in this episode is we're going to talk about James Webb Space Telescope, which launched on Christmas morning. It was an amazing launch. It launched aboard an Ariane 5 rocket from French Guiana, and the European Space Agency did a great job assembling that rocket, getting that rocket to launch. They threaded that needle of the launch performance of getting James Webb Space Telescope into orbit. They were so successful. They performed so well that the mission, by the time it made its few other orbital adjustments on its way to 1 million miles away from Earth, it was so good we actually added years to the entire life cycle of James Webb Space Telescope. So that's tremendous, because we're going to talk about the fact that it's at L2 and what that means. What does the spacecraft have to do while it's there over its lifetime to give us this view of the past and look further into the 13.5 billion years ago towards the first light and the first galaxies forming in our universe. It was a long time coming, and if you go back, we did an episode where we were talking about the challenges, almost 3 decades of James Webb Space Telescope getting to this point, of actually getting to the point where it can launch, and seeing them perform at such a high level with something that has been so delicate and critical. James Webb Space Telescope, they performed when they needed to. They performed, and it getting to launch was the biggest struggle, it seems so far. Knock on wood, because we are superstitious here, or at least we'll do whatever helps. So far, James Webb Space Telescope is doing a very good job on its way out there. Basically, a lot of the things they were doing, first thing was obviously get the solar panels out, get them deployed so you can start charging up those batteries so you have onboard power. Once they got out a little bit further, they started repositioning the spacecraft and getting the heat shields out so that the telescope can start getting into its right position. And what that does is it protects the actual telescope side, the instruments of the spacecraft, from the heat from the sun that it's going to experience. So it's been a lot of fun watching all the content that's out there. There's a lot of space and science communicators that I'm talking about James Webb Space Telescope. We've been taking it a little bit easy around here in the holidays because it has just been extremely busy and there's been a lot going on, but all is decently well. So we're still kicking here on this crazy rock called Earth. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit more about just just how much struggle this has been from James Webb Space Telescope, and what kind of a lesson that is for us in the life that we live in. Today, we're going to talk about just a little bit more about what Lagrange points are. Like, what is L2? Why is it going there? Why is it important? A lot of folks have reached out about it, and it is a complicated topic, so I'm going to do my best to try and explain that in a simple way. And then I'll go over some actions and lessons from this year, because we're not really doing resolutions here. We're more talking about what we actually did and then what we plan to do. And of course, the theme of this, since I started this podcast, was when I do say it on this podcast, that means it's a kick in the ass for me to do it in real life, and it's really helped me do that. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, and then that's how we're going to close out this year. So Happy New Year to everybody. Let's jump into this. We wish you the best in 2022 and a lot of progress for all of us, not only in space, but in our lives and making humanity a better thing. So let's dive into it. So like we talked about, James Webb Space Telescope launched on Christmas morning. Again, flawless launch, given all the struggles that it went through. And after decades of struggle, we talked about it just a second ago, but that episode where we discussed all the challenges that James Webb Space Telescope has had over its 3 decades. Think about the story that tells. After decades of struggle and doubt, and what is it going to launch? Is James Webb Space Telescope going to launch? And how many delays happened, and how many times we were let down by the expectations of what it could be and what we wanted to do, and then what ended up being the reality of what we could do. I mean, that doesn't that spell so much? We're talking about the balance, right? Doesn't that encapsulate what's going on in our world right now, right? Where there's so much that needs to be worked on, and it's such a difficult time. This is a message, James Webb Space Telescope's mission of getting out, to be able for us to have early astronomical evidence of what the first universes are, what the first light did after the universe began. I think that's a hopeful message for what we're going through now with COVID-19, and how the world either goes back to normal or becomes something new that we can then continue our lives with and not feel like it's never ending. I think there is some hope in that, even though that there is struggle. It is not definite. The struggle it could be also a representation of the incredible size, metaphorically, of the task at hand, right? Sending a telescope that's better than Hubble, that helps us look back into the past, I guess is not a surprise in retrospect that it would be difficult to get it there. Almost like in a Greek comedy kind of thing, where it's like it seems like it would be a really easy thing, but in our, it's like that in life, right? There are things you want to do in life, you think it's going to be easy. My example's going to college and becoming an aerospace engineer. That challenge was so much more difficult, and it really had little to do with the content that I was learning. It wasn't that I couldn't learn the content. It was everything around it, right? Life, figuring out how my brain works so that I could study properly for my own brain, and not feel constantly like I couldn't learn anything, or I wasn't smart enough. I was just doing it in a way that just didn't work for me. And when I figured that out, things started to line up. It was really amazing. And then, of course, just growing up at that time, I was not in a great spot. And that's kind of, NASA's had such a struggle in this time period of James Webb Space Telescope, right? The end of Space Shuttle program, kind of losing focus of where we were going to end up going after Space Shuttle, and how we kind of stagnated for the last 2 decades at least. James Webb Space Telescope is part of that story of the growing of NASA. And you can see this last year, again, going back to what James Webb Space Telescope tells us in our everyday lives. Think about how much struggle it was to get that out, but think about now where NASA is, and where the space program is right now across the planet, where we have on record. I think this is the most orbital rocket launches that have ever happened, beating out some of the early space race years of the 1960s. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think there still might be a launch today. I don't remember, but I think that number still needs to be calculated. But regardless, we're now at this place where not only have we had the most orbital rocket launches of all time, we've also had a successful mission to Mars. Multiple countries have had successful missions to Mars. We've had all of the development with SpaceX and launching things into orbit. We've had the return of human space flight with NASA's Commercial Crew Program, with SpaceX, with Crew Dragon, now repeatedly and sending up more and more missions to the International Space Station to keep and reinvigorate the human spaceflight program for the U.S., where we haven't had that option to send our own astronauts on our own rockets on our own soil for a very, very long time. Again, part of that James Webb Space Telescope era. There's been so much that has happened. The first all-civilian orbital flight with Inspiration 4, which without a doubt I think is top mission of the entire year. As the opinion of this podcast, I think that mission alone has inspired me just as much as the Demo 2 mission back early in the pandemic, where we were just breaking ground and having so much progress in space, again, in this terribly divisive and distracting and chaotic time that we live in. And then at the same time, Starship by SpaceX is underway to get to its first orbital launch. We've seen multiple successes of the actual belly flop and burn maneuver to actually successfully land a Starship, and now we're going to start implementing the Super Heavy booster, and that launch is going to be insane. And one of the things we want to do for next year is get out there, is to actually see it. So we're going to be looking at how things play out, as much as we might want to plan for 2022. That's going to be difficult. But we're going to do our best. One of the great things from this year, from 2021, is, through our 3D printing lab, AG 3D Printing, we've been able to fund a trip down to Boca Chica, Texas, to Starbase. So we're just waiting for the right time to do that. As things level out, cases are crazy. Omicron, obviously, spread is ridiculous. It's been all over the place, but we will see how this year plays out. So as part of like a balance thing, I think as far as COVID stuff goes, one of the things I'm looking forward to do more and to push myself on is to, when we have those moments where cases are low and it's easy enough to go out and hang out with people, I think that is a really important thing moving forward here for my own sanity. Taking your precautions, making sure you know what the latest science is, but keeping up on it, and because it is constantly changing and evolving, and then, but then pushing to make sure that mentally you're okay and still talking to people. I think one of the great things about this podcast and about what we've been able to do here with this podcast, you as the listeners and watchers and people who are part of this Today's Space community, part of this podcast, is we've been able to communicate. We've been able to stay in touch. And if I didn't have that, I don't know where my social skills would be today. I don't know where, I don't know how much stranger I would be. I'm not saying I'm not strange. I'm just saying it probably would have been a little weirder. So I want to make sure that I continue progress there, to keep the connections with you guys up and running. And we've got some plans for how we make this community even tighter and bring us all together, and to make the experience of Today in Space even greater. So there's a lot that we have in store. We obviously want to thank everybody who joined us on the People of Science segment for this year. We had so many amazing people come on the podcast, and that segment of People of Science, where we interview people who work in science, who think scientifically, who their everyday life is around a scientific thing, whether it's science, technology, engineering, math, art, however it plays out. we've really enjoyed hearing about other people's STEM origin stories. How do they get into this? What what is it that sparked the imagination to get into something crazy like getting into an engineering field? And we've got a lot more planned for this year because we just didn't have enough time to schedule all of them. So definitely look forward to more of those segments. If there's anyone that you'd like us to have on, please make sure to hit us up. We'd love to get out there and talk to more people. That's one of the cool things about this last year is we didn't have to travel and we were still able to talk to so many different people. And yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to that. I guess next let's jump into, since we're talking about some more personal stuff here, let's go into actions and lessons here from 2021. So I wrote down some things that we implemented on a daily basis here. Simple ideas, right? Like the first one is go do it. Like don't just think about and try and analyze what could happen and what could be and what might happen. Like you don't know what it's going to be like until you actually do it. And that's the same thing as like my next one, which is like writing things down makes them real, right? Even that small act of writing down, let's say you have a goal or something you want to do. I've been using checklists as a daily thing for a really long time, and I've been even using that for the podcast too. We've been mind mapping these episodes. It helps me get these ideas, all these things that we want to talk about, put them into a thing that we can, like an organization that helps me remember what we're going to talk about, which is important, but also focus my ideas. And there's been a lot of big goals that we've had for a while here that we've started to really make headway on, and a lot of that is thanks to people like you who've been so supportive and reaching out, and I really appreciate everyone that does, who's been following along, and anybody that's brand new to the journey. If you're into not only space and science and hearing about all this crazy engineering stuff and nerdy stuff, there's a human aspect to all this. That's what that People of Science segment is all about, right? There's the science, which can be very dry and technical and complicated, and then there's the human side of things, the humans doing the science, and that is also complicated and but it's different too, right? That's part of the thing that made James Webb Space Telescope so difficult. Other than being an extremely hard technical problem to achieve, super complex, like it's not even done, it has six months from the launch before it's actually going to get to its place where it can take its first observations, 1 million miles from Earth. That in itself is an extremely technical problem. But getting all of the people in line, getting all of the contractors, right? It became James Webb Space Telescope became a project between 3 agencies: NASA, the European Space Agency, and the Canadian Space Agency, right? And others as well, contractors building the things to put them together. I mean, if you look back at the almost 30 years of James Webb Space Telescope, there's all these different designs. I was looking at some old literature. I was trying to figure out how much fuel the telescope's going to use once it's at L2 to keep itself in position over time. And you could just see like the evolution of what they thought it was going to look like. And some of them, they don't even look at all like what the final thing is. And a lot of that is the people behind the scenes, right? And a lot of what makes SpaceX successful is the people behind the scenes, right? The team that works together to solve those engineering problems. And the same thing goes for NASA. I think one of the more beautiful things that's happened in this 2021 year has been NASA really backing what they're doing, backing where they want to go with the next stage of space flight, and their partnership with SpaceX is a good example of them sticking up for that regardless of what the political situation is. Whether there's the whole contract with the human landing system with Blue Origin, we saw that the culture of NASA and SpaceX has melded very well together, and they're learning from each other, and that's a beautiful thing, and that's super important for a space program, a space industry, is having the people and the culture aligned in some way. It's crazy. We've talked about this before. We're all crazy emotional apes, and as amazing as science can be, we're not robots. We can't just do science. like that. We can't just do it a snap of a finger. It requires getting into a state where you're able to do good science. And part of that is being on a good team. Part of that is being on a good team where, like, if you're having a rough day, one of your teammates can come in and help you out. Like, that's a big thing, and you can support each other and make sure that, you know, you keep each other on the right path for what you're trying to do, which is, in this case, launch one of the most prolific astronomical devices ever sent into space with James Webb. So people are really important. It's extremely important to get that aligned, and it's amazing to see that. And even with James Webb Space Telescope, the fact that they were able to get through those almost 30 years, decades of waiting for launch, when launch happened, they've done so well that they've allowed to give 10 more years, at least, to the James Webb Space Telescope while it's in orbit. So let's close out with that. Let's close out with why James Webb Space Telescope even needs fuel once it gets to this Lagrange point, right? Everyone talks about L2. I think Lagrange points are often talked about as like a single point, almost as if the James Webb Space Telescope is going out there and then it's just sitting still in space, not moving, which you know, if you're talking about in space, you've got to ask, not moving, relative to what is always the question you've got to ask. Okay, it's not moving. Well, if I look at the Earth from a certain vantage point, the Earth isn't going to move, but that's because you're probably moving with the Earth so that you're both moving the same speed, which makes it look like it's not moving. But that's just a physics and like a 3D space phenomenon. But with James Webb Space Telescope, it's not just sitting at L2. And I tried to take what's visible already. We'll put a graphic of this up right now, but I tried to take a visual representation of what that means. And so you've got the sun, right? It has its own gravitational forces. It's pulling on things around it. It's manipulating space and time around it, right? Earth is orbiting around the sun because it's in its gravitational influence. And as what we're looking for L2 Lagrange points are these pockets of gravitational pull where the balance between the two things pulling is just the centrifugal force, so just the orbit. So when we say L2 and we say it's the Lagrange point 2, it's not a point that's sitting at rest. It's a point on the moving thing. So you've got, let's see. I don't have it ready, but okay. So here's the sun and the Earth's orbiting, right? So we want to put James Webb Space Telescope at L2, which is the point behind Earth and the sun. So you've got the sun, the Earth, and then you've got James Webb Space Telescope. In that pocket, the sun and the Earth are pulling against each other, and behind Earth, about 1 million miles away, as it's orbiting, is a great point for you to put James Webb Space Telescope as the Earth orbits the sun. So as the telescope is behind the Earth all the time, it's protected a lot from the sun because you've got Earth blocking a lot of that heat, which means we could put up those heat shields behind the James Webb Space Telescope. And now you don't have the brightness of the sun getting in the way of the telescope. So you've got James Webb Space Telescope always behind the Earth, which is behind the sun, giving this great dark view for the telescope to look back into the early, well, to whatever it wants in the universe, right? So Lagrange points are these pockets where the gravitational pull is minimal, almost zero in certain cases. At that point, ideally, it would be zero. And so James Webb Space Telescope is doing this halo orbit in that area. And so what that provides is a really low-cost way to have your spacecraft be in space and be in a relatively easy position where you don't need to spend a ton of fuel reorienting it and getting it to go in the right spot. It's just going to kind of keep doing tiny bursts to keep it in that halo orbit within that pocket. I don't know if that's any easier than calling it a point. I don't know if my explanation was any better, but I hope that explains it a little bit better. And we do have that visual and some other visuals from NASA to help explain that a little bit better. It's an advantageous position to put a spacecraft that you want to be in a good-looking position deep into space without any sunlight. So, and actually, I could pull up NASA's explanation. That actually might be better. So Lagrange points, according to NASA, are positions in space where the gravitational forces of a two-body system, like the Sun and the Earth, produce enhanced regions of attraction and repulsion. These can be used by spacecraft to reduce fuel consumption needed to remain in position. So again, going back to the whole thing about space and why it's so hard, you only have the fuel that you bring with you. So you need to budget out all of your moves ahead of time and bring enough fuel for that. And that's the magic of what James Webb Space Telescope did, is it saved so much fuel by doing orbital mechanics so efficiently that we were able to have more fuel to keep up this L2 halo orbit for an extra 10 years. So talking about fuel efficiency, that is a beautiful, beautiful thing that the James Webb Space Telescope did to keep this mission going. So you're getting even more out of the money that we invested into this, right? Which was a lot of money, and time, as we know. So these Lagrange points between this two-body system, think about it. If there was a three-body system, right, that you were considering, you would have different Lagrange points. It would have a different pattern to the gravitational pull and attraction and repulsion that's going on. And when those balance, those pockets are where you want to put things that need to stay in place or in a certain orbit without a lot of fuel moves. So this brings us to our closeout, folks. James Webb Space Telescope has gone on its way. That chapter of getting it to launch is over, and we move on to the next chapter where it's actually going to start doing its observations. And it's doing it in infrared light, which is going to be very different from Hubble. But we're going to see some really amazing things, and we're going to dive more into this, and we hope that you guys send in your questions. We'd love to hear from you. What is it that you want to learn? This Lagrange point depiction that we're talking about here, this is a question from you guys. This is things that you guys reached out and said, hey, can we talk about that more? A lot of, it doesn't really make sense. What more could we talk about? And we appreciate every time that you send those questions. So you can reach out to us on Today in Space Pod on Instagram and Twitter. We've got todayinSpacePodcast@gmail.com for any of your questions. And, of course, Today in Space on TikTok. And we're also on Substack at todayinspace.substack.com. We're going to be using that more often to dive deeper into some of these topics. But that's it, folks. Thanks for joining us. We really hope you have a good rest of your year, the last few hours here of 2021. Write them off. Look forward to the future, and we wish you nothing but the best in this next year. We hope it's sizably better than 2021 and incredibly, galactically better than 2020. So we wish you nothing but the best. Thanks for joining us. As always, don't forget, if you're looking for anything 3D printed or want to figure out what 3D printing is, you hear about 3D printing things in space and what's possible, and maybe you've got a product idea. Maybe you're like, hey, I'd like to start a business, or I'd like to start an Etsy shop, or there's this thing we want to have around the house, something that isn't made anymore. We want to make a few of them so we've got some extras. 3D printing is available for you thanks to our 3D printing lab, AG3D. So we help people bring ideas into reality. We do that with our own ideas here. We were 3D printing some door stops the other day. And it doesn't end just there. I mean, we've helped companies like SnapCollar, who's now putting their product out there and satisfying their first Kickstarter goals and creating their business. That idea started on paper, and we help them get those first ideas out there, those first models and shapes to iterate and figure out what the right thing is. That's something we can do with AG3D printing. And even at the bare minimum, we have our Etsy shop, ag3dprinting.etsy.com, where we sell things like this rocket ship phone stand, among other things, as well as, if you've got a PS4, we've got PS4 stands and other things out there that you guys have reached out and asked for, and things that we use on a daily basis. So ag3dprinting.etsy.com. Go there if you want to help support the podcast. Reach out to us at ag3dprinting or ag3d-printing.com to get a free quote, and reach out if you want to start an idea. I know there's a few of you right now, listeners of the podcast, that we're going to be doing some work here in this future. And I'll close out by saying one of the other actions I'm going to take in this next year is a continuation of what I've been working on the last 4 months or so, which is, we kind of reshaped the production of this podcast to fit better with just my own health, my own mental health, my own physical health. It's been really, really good so far, and I want to do that. One of the big changes was we did another time audit of like how much time it takes, what's necessary, how much time do I actually have, and with a day job, and of course trying to also have a social life, whatever that means here in 2021 and 2022. But keeping in touch with people in my life, those are all things I want to do. And again, like we talked about, writing it down, it made it real. We actually made the schedule. We actually started sticking to it, and it really started working. And one of the big things was taking the workload out of the weekends, and leaving myself the weekends to actually enjoy, to see people. That's when most people are free. So that has been really, really nice. It's amazing what, we think about setting goals for tasks that we want to do, but when it comes to setting aside time for rest, it just, for some reason, isn't obvious, or it's not something that we're used to doing, and it is so helpful. So I will continue to push myself to do that, because it's made such big differences in my own physical recovery from all the physical injuries that I've experienced over the years. I'm finally taken care of, and my mental health. Being able to feel like taking a break is going to actually pay dividends for the things that I do want to do, and not that it's getting in the way of me doing things. These are really big lessons that we've learned from doing this year, and we hope to continue and do that more. We hope to bring back the Galileo project, our 3D printed rocket. But yeah, there's a lot to come here. We've got a lot more to share, and we just want to say thank you for joining us on Today in Space podcast. We appreciate each and every one of you. Don't forget to spread the word, like the podcast, share, and make sure to follow and subscribe wherever you do listen. Thanks for joining us. We wish you nothing but the best in 2022. Live long and prosper. We'll see you next time and next year for another episode of Today in Space.